Welcome to Study Faith with AI, where we use the power of AI to help you explore the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
I'm Meg Jensen,
And I'm Paul Carter.
and we're Google AIs. Whether you're a lifelong member or just starting to learn about the church, we're here to dive deep into its history, beliefs, and culture.
So if you're ready to learn, you're in the right place.
That's right.
Let's get started. All right, so we're diving into some requested content today, and it's a big one. It's the Book of Mormon witnesses, but specifically we're going to be focusing on the 8 witnesses. Now, whether you're coming at this from a perspective of faith, or maybe you're approaching it with a little bit of skepticism, either way, we're going to go beyond just the surface level information and uncover some really fascinating details about this group of individuals.
Absolutely. We're going to be diving deep into their experience, looking at their backgrounds, their connections to Joseph Smith, and ultimately how their testimony impacts those seeking truth.
So to kind of set the stage right, we're dealing with Joseph Smith's claim that he translated this ancient record, the Book of Mormon, from these golden plates. And to back up his claims, he brought forth individuals to act as witnesses. And these witnesses fill into 2 groups, the 3 witnesses and the 8 witnesses. But here's something that I always find really interesting about this whole thing. Joseph Smith himself claimed that it was actually dangerous for anyone other than himself to view these plates. He even said it could be fatal. Yet the 8 witnesses claim to have physically handled these plates. That's kind of a head-scratcher, isn't it?
It is, and it's definitely one of the threads that we'll be pulling on today as we kind of unravel this story.
So let's start with the basics. Who were these 8 individuals who stepped forward to essentially vouch for Joseph Smith's claims? We have Christian Whitmer, Jacob Whitmer, Peter Whitmer Jr., John Whitmer, Hiram Page, Joseph Smith Sr., Hiram Smith, and Samuel Smith. Anything jump out at you just from that list of names?
Well, right away you see the family connections. We have several Whitmers there, along with Joseph Smith's own father and brother. And that's something that definitely raises questions about, potential bias and influence, something that we'll explore a bit further today.
Yeah, family ties can make things a little sticky, especially when we're dealing with these extraordinary claims. So let's talk about what exactly these 8 men claim to have experienced. We know that they said they saw the plates, but it wasn't just a quick glance, was it?
No, it was much more than that. Unlike the 3 witnesses whose experience was more spiritual and visionary, the 8 witnesses testified to an actual physical encounter. They claim they handled the plates, felt the weight of the golden leaves, and saw the engravings. It wasn't some kind of ethereal vision. It was presented as a very tangible, real-world interaction.
Wow, that's pretty wild to think about. To hold something that was so central to Joseph Smith's claims.
Yeah.
That must have been quite an experience, whether they truly believed it or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And that emphasis on physicality is something worth unpacking, I think. It's a recurring theme throughout their accounts, and it seems to have been strategically used to bolster the Book of Mormon's credibility.
Yeah, a tangible experience is much harder to dismiss as just imagination or delusion.
Exactly. But as we'll see as we dig deeper, even those concrete claims aren't without their own complexities and contradictions.
Ooh, I love a good contradiction. Lay it on me. What kind of conflicting details are we talking about here?
Well, let's take John Whitmer, for instance. He remained a staunch defender of the Book of Mormon throughout his life and consistently stated that none of the witnesses ever denied their testimony. In 1876, he said, "I have never heard that any one of the 3 or 8 witnesses ever denied the testimony that they have borne to the book as published in the first edition of the Book of Mormon."
Okay, so far so good. He's standing by his account.
He is. But here's where it gets interesting. In an earlier statement, he described seeing the plates through a supernatural power. He said, "I don't deny my testimony. I saw them through the power for it, through a supernatural power."
Wait a second. So he's affirming the experience, but he's also suggesting that it wasn't a straightforward physical viewing? It almost sounds like he's saying they needed some kind of spiritual boost to actually see them.
Yeah, that's definitely one way to interpret it. And it raises some really fascinating questions. If it was purely physical, like it's often presented, then why would there be this need for a supernatural power to make it happen?
Yeah, it's not exactly a slam dunk proof of anything, is it? And speaking of puzzling statements, what about that curious response from Hiram Smith, Joseph's own brother? When he was asked about his experience, he simply said, "I only have 2 eyes and 2 hands. What's up with that?" It's not exactly a ringing endorsement.
That's a really important detail. It's a very cryptic response. You might even say evasive.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if maybe he was struggling with his own doubts. Or maybe just trying to avoid going into specifics. It seems like even those closest to Joseph Smith had a hard time really articulating exactly what they experienced.
It does. And this theme of spiritual influence, even within accounts that are emphasizing this physicality, it's a recurring one. It's almost like they're trying to reconcile these two very different ways of understanding what happened.
So are we saying that even the believers were hinting at alternative explanations?
I think it's definitely suggestive, and it highlights the fact that we're not dealing with the straightforward objective facts here. We're dealing with complex human experiences.
Okay, so we've got these 8 guys, some with closer ties to Joseph Smith than others,
Mhm.
all claiming to have handled these ancient plates. But there's this underlying question of, was it purely physical? Or was there something more mystical or even supernatural going on? And then to add another layer to this whole thing, Oliver Cowdery, one of the 3 witnesses, actually signed the 8 witnesses' testimony for them. They didn't even sign it themselves. Why would that be?
That's a detail that often gets overlooked. But it raises some serious questions about the authenticity and the independence of the 8 witnesses' account. Why would Oliver Cowdery be involved in this way? Was it simply a formality? Or was there something more going on behind the scenes?
Yeah, it definitely adds another layer of mystery to this whole thing. It makes you wonder if there were concerns about some of the 8's commitment to the cause, or maybe even pressure to conform to a specific narrative.
It's hard to say for sure, but it's certainly a point worth pondering. And it leads us to another really intriguing aspect of this story, the connection to Mark Twain.
Wait, Mark Twain,
Mm.
as in the famous author. What does he have to do with all of this?
It's a very surprising connection, but it turns out that Twain's family actually had ties to early Mormonism. His mother's cousin was married to Martin Harris, one of the 3 witnesses, and Twain himself had some rather pointed things to say about Harris and his involvement with Joseph Smith.
Oh, I bet he did. Mark Twain wasn't exactly known for holding back his opinions.
No, he wasn't. So in his autobiography, Twain writes about his relative marrying Harris. He says, "About the year 1829 or 30, my mother's cousin married a man named Martin Harris." And then in another piece of writing, he describes Harris as an exceedingly devout and credulous man and a continual prey to the impostors who roamed the country.
Ouch. That's a pretty scathing assessment. And coming from someone with a family connection, it adds a whole other dimension to the story. Makes you wonder about the role of personality and belief, and maybe even gullibility in shaping these testimonies.
It's a fascinating piece of the puzzle. It really highlights the personal and often messy side of history. These weren't just abstract figures. These were real people with complex motivations and relationships.
So true. So as we kind of delve deeper into the lives and experiences of the 8 witnesses, we'll keep exploring these complexities. But before we do, I want to take a step back and consider the bigger picture here. When exactly was this testimony written, and what was its purpose within the whole Book of Mormon narrative?
The timing is crucial here. The 8 witnesses' testimony was written in late June of 1829, just a few months before the Book of Mormon was published. So it's pretty clear that this document was intended to lend credibility to Joseph Smith's claims and to kind of bolster the book's authenticity from the outset.
It's like building hype before the big release.
Yeah.
Get some respected figures to back you up before you drop something as unconventional as the Book of Mormon on the world.
Yeah.
But speaking of context, we can't forget about the historical setting of all of this. We're talking about the Second Great Awakening, this time of intense religious fervor, and a fascination with the supernatural. It seems like the perfect breeding ground for extraordinary experiences and claims.
Absolutely. The social and religious climate of the early 19th century was ripe for visions and miracles and new revelations. People were really searching for spiritual meaning, and many were open to the possibility of divine intervention in their lives.
So we've got this group of 8 witnesses, with their varied connections to Joseph Smith, all claiming to have had this tangible experience with these golden plates. But even their accounts are tinged with these hints of spiritual influence. And there are these lingering questions about their independence and their motivation. We've got Mark Twain chiming in with his family connection and his less than flattering assessment of one of the key players. And all of this is unfolding against the backdrop of this massive religious revival sweeping the nation. It's a lot to unpack.
It is, but that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. We're not just dealing with black and white testimonies here. We're exploring the nuances of human experience, the interplay of faith and perception, and the complexities of historical context.
And that's what keeps me coming back for more. So with all of this swirling around in our minds, let's shift our focus to the experience itself for a moment. How did the 8 witnesses' claims differ from those of the 3 witnesses?
The contrast between the 2 groups is pretty striking. While the three witnesses describe the spiritual vision involving an angel and divine light, the eight witnesses really emphasize the physicality of their encounter.
Right. They focused on these very tangible details, the weight of the plates, the engravings, the feeling of leaves in their hands. It's almost like they were trying to ground their experience in something concrete, something that could be easily grasped and understood.
Precisely. And that emphasis on the physical served a very specific purpose, I think, to counter potential skepticism and really bolster the credibility of their claims. After all, a physical experience is harder to dismiss as mere imagination or delusion, especially in a time when people were already inclined to believe in the supernatural. And it leads us to a question I think that's really intriguing. What was the nature of the relationships between these eight witnesses and Joseph Smith? We know there were these family ties, but how did those relationships impact their experiences and
Yeah.
ultimately their testimonies?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because, I mean, it's one thing to believe your brother, your cousin when they tell you some wild story, but it's another thing entirely to sign a document attesting to it. Knowing that document is going to be scrutinized for generations to come.
Exactly. And the relationships between the eight witnesses and Joseph Smith were definitely complex. Some were unwavering in their loyalty, like Joseph Smith Sr., his father, and Hiram, his brother. It seemed like for them, family ties and religious conviction were kind of seamlessly intertwined.
Okay, it's almost like their faith in Joseph was an extension of that family bond. But what about the others? Didn't some of them end up leaving the church?
They did. John Whitmer, for example, eventually became disillusioned and parted ways with the church. But even those who left, even those who disagreed with Joseph Smith on various matters, they never formally denied their experience with the plates.
That's interesting. Even when there were conflicts or disagreements, that core experience seemed to remain a constant. It makes you wonder if maybe, for some of them, holding on to that testimony was a way of preserving something meaningful from a time when their faith was stronger, even if their views had kind of evolved over time.
Yeah, it's a really compelling thought. And it speaks to the power of belief. The way it can shape our memories and perceptions even when circumstances change. It also raises these questions about the motivations behind those unwavering testimonies. Were they driven by sincere belief, by loyalty to Joseph Smith, social pressure, or maybe a combination of all of these factors?
It's hard to disentangle those threads. And we have to remember, we're looking back at all of this from a 21st century perspective. These were people who lived in a very different time, a time when folk magic and treasure seeking and a belief in the supernatural were just deeply ingrained in the culture. These weren't fringe ideas. They were part of the fabric of everyday life.
Absolutely. And that context, I think, is so crucial for understanding the mindset of these eight witnesses. They were products of their time, and their belief systems were shaped by the world around them. I mean, in their minds, the idea of ancient golden plates and divine revelation wasn't necessarily as outlandish as it might seem to us today.
It's like trying to understand someone from a completely different culture. You have to step into their world and see things through their lens to really grasp the meaning behind their actions and beliefs. So with that in mind, let's get back to the heart of their experience, the plates. We've talked about the physicality of their encounter. But how did their claims actually differ from what the three witnesses described?
The difference is really quite stark. The three witnesses had a very mystical, visionary experience. They described seeing an angel who presented the plates, surrounded by a heavenly light. It was a spiritual encounter, not a physical one. The eight witnesses, on the other hand, really emphasized the tangible, concrete nature of their interaction. They talked about hefting the plates, feeling the weight of the metal, tracing the engravings with their fingers.
Okay, so two completely different types of experiences, yet both claiming to validate the Book of Mormon. But then we've also got those later statements from some of the eight witnesses, like John Whitmer, who talked about seeing the plates through a supernatural power. It almost seems like they're trying to bridge the gap between the physical and the spiritual, to kind of reconcile those two seemingly contradictory accounts. What do you make of that?
I think it speaks to the inherent ambiguity of these experiences. We're dealing with human memory, perception, and interpretation, all kind of filtered through the lens of faith. It's possible that the eight witnesses deeply invested in Joseph Smith's claims and immersed in a culture that readily accepted the supernatural, experienced something that felt incredibly real and tangible to them. But whether that tangibility was rooted in physical reality or shaped by their beliefs and expectations, that's a question that remains open for debate.
Yeah, it's like that saying, seeing is believing. But in this case, maybe it was more like believing is seeing. Their faith may have actually influenced their perception,
Right.
creating this powerful experience that felt undeniably real.
Exactly. And that's why I think it's so crucial to approach these historical accounts with a critical eye. We can't just take testimonies at face value. We need to consider the psychological factors at play, the cultural context, the power of belief to shape our experiences.
Yeah, we're like detectives trying to piece together this puzzle from these fragmented pieces of evidence. We have these accounts, these
Hmm.
testimonies, these intriguing details. But it's up to us to determine how they all fit together, to sift through those layers of interpretation and arrive at our own understanding of what might have actually transpired.
That's a great analogy. And it highlights the importance of critical thinking, of engaging with history on multiple levels. Don't just accept one side or the other blindly. Dig deeper, ask questions, consider different perspectives.
And speaking of different perspectives, we've talked a lot about the believers, about those who accepted Joseph Smith's claims and stood by their testimonies. But what about those who doubted? Were there dissenting voices among those who knew Joseph Smith or witnessed the events surrounding the Book of Mormon?
There were definitely skeptics and critics right from the outset. Many people found Joseph Smith's claims outlandish and saw the whole affair as an elaborate hoax. Some even accused him of being a con artist, preying on the gullibility of those who were caught up in the religious fervor of the time. But their voices were often drowned out by the enthusiasm of the believers and the growing momentum of the movement.
Right. It's like any new religious movement. You have those who are drawn to the message, those who find meaning and purpose in the belief system, and then you have those who are skeptical, who see it as a threat or a delusion.
Exactly. And in the case of early Mormonism, that divide between believers and skeptics was particularly sharp. It was a time of great religious upheaval, and the emergence of the Book of Mormon with its claims of ancient origins and divine revelation, that really added fuel to the fire.
So we've got this fascinating mix of faith and skepticism and cultural context, and these conflicting accounts. It's a story that continues to captivate and challenge us even centuries later.
It does, and it speaks to the enduring power of belief, the complexity of human experience, and the ongoing search for truth. Whether you approach this story as a believer or a skeptic, there's no denying that the eight witnesses play a pivotal role in shaping the history of the Book of Mormon.
Absolutely. As we wrap up part 2 of our deep dive, I'm left with a sense of wonder, but also this renewed appreciation for the complexities of history. It's not a neat and tidy narrative. It's a tapestry woven from these conflicting threads, individual experiences, and the ever-shifting landscape of belief.
Well said. And in the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore the lasting impact of the eight witnesses' testimony, the questions that it raises, and the ways in which it continues to shape discussions about the Book of Mormon today.
We've been exploring the lives and the testimonies of the Book of Mormon's 8 witnesses. We've talked about their connections to Joseph Smith, the inconsistencies in their accounts. We even dug into Mark Twain's family ties to this whole story. But now it's time to take a step back and consider the big picture. What is the lasting impact of their testimony? How does it continue to shape conversations about the Book of Mormon even today?
Yeah, their testimony is really a cornerstone of belief for many Latter-day Saints. It's often presented as this kind of irrefutable evidence, a tangible manifestation of the divine that kind of transcends faith and enters the realm of historical fact. And the fact that these eight men, some of whom later distanced themselves from the church, never formally recanted their experience, that's often cited as proof of its authenticity.
Yeah, you're right. It is a powerful argument, especially for those who view the Book of Mormon as sacred scripture. But as we've discovered throughout this deep dive, it's not quite as simple as that. There are these layers of complexity, contradictions that raise questions about the nature of their experience and the motivations behind those unwavering testimonies.
And that's where critical thinking, I think, comes in. It's not about just blindly accepting one narrative or the other. It's about engaging with those complexities, the ambiguities, the gray areas that make history so fascinating and, frankly, so human.
Exactly. So for those listening out there, whether you're grappling with your own faith or exploring different perspectives, or just fascinated by the intricacies of this historical puzzle, what guidance can we offer? What questions should they be asking themselves as they weigh the testimony of these eight men?
Well, I think it's essential to recognize that. We're dealing with subjective experiences here. Memory is malleable. Perception is influenced by so many different factors. Interpretation is often shaped by our pre-existing beliefs. So as you consider these accounts, ask yourself, how might their expectations or their social context, even just the cultural norms at the time, have influenced what they saw and how they interpreted it? Is it possible that their yearning for the divine, their desire to believe, shaped their perceptions and created an experience that felt undeniably real to them, regardless of whether it aligns with, our understanding of objective reality?
Those are some really thought-provoking questions. And it makes me think back to something we talked about earlier, the prevalence of folk magic treasure seeking, belief in the supernatural in the early 19th century. These weren't fringe ideas. They were woven into the fabric of everyday life.
Exactly. And that context is so crucial when we're evaluating these accounts. They lived in a world where the miraculous wasn't just possible, it was almost expected. So when they encountered something extraordinary, something that resonated with their deeply held beliefs, it's not surprising that they interpreted it through that lens.
Yeah, it's like we're all detectives piecing together clues from this bygone era. We have these fragments of evidence, these tantalizing details, but we also have to consider the biases, the cultural baggage, the human fallibility that inevitably shapes any historical narrative.
Absolutely. And as we strive to understand the past, I think we have to acknowledge our own limitations, our own perspectives and preconceptions that color our interpretation of events.
It's humbling, isn't it, to realize that history isn't just this collection of facts, it's this ongoing conversation, this constant reinterpretation, as we grapple with new evidence-evolving perspectives and our own evolving understanding of the world.
It is, and that's what makes it so endlessly fascinating. It's not about arriving at definitive answers. It's about that journey of exploration, the process of asking difficult questions, and that willingness to embrace uncertainty.
I love that. It's a reminder that the search for truth is a journey, not a destination. And sometimes the most valuable insights come from embracing those questions, even when the answers themselves remain elusive.
I completely agree. Whether you approach this story as a believer, as a skeptic, or somewhere in between, I hope this deep dive has provided you with some new perspectives, sparked your curiosity, and encouraged you to keep exploring this fascinating and often contradictory world of history.
And on that note, we'll bid farewell to our listeners, leaving them to ponder the legacy of the Book of Mormon, its witnesses, and the enduring questions that they raise. Keep digging deep, friends. Keep asking those thought-provoking questions. And most importantly, keep that curiosity alive.
If you find value in this exploration, please like, share, follow, and consider becoming a subscriber. Your contributions help keep these conversations going and allows us to maintain the highest quality production. You can find all the details at studyfaithwithai.com. Thank you for being part of this journey.